Virginians have always stood at the crossroads of the fight for freedom. It is a battle in which we all reap the benefits. Following the Second World War, two nations, the United States of America and the Soviet Union, emerged as superpowers and would dominate world affairs for the next 40 years. These countries possessed multiple nuclear weapons, which, if used, would assure not only their mutual destruction, but world ruination as well. Because these nations had deep-seated political, economic, and social differences, there existed a constant state of tension, leading to ongoing conflicts and threats around the world. Among these confrontations was the Cuban Missile Crisis in October 1962, which is still considered to be the most dangerous moment in human history.
At the end of the 50s, Khrushchev demanded that we straighten out the situation in Berlin, and Kennedy rebuffed that and said the way the man is talking, it's going to be war before we know it. And that's sort of set the stage for what happened in Cuba. Castro succeeded in 1959 in taking control, and property of Americans in Cuba was nationalized. And a significant number of Americans either fled, were imprisoned, or were killed. So we put an embargo on Cuba for trade in 1961. What we didn't know at that time, that starting in March of 1961, Russia struck a cooperation agreement with the Cubans. Cuba was to us a communist nation, as Russia was, and it had to be viewed as an enemy because it was a threat and it was at our doorstep. Khrushchev introduced the idea of positioning missiles in Cuba, and it wasn't until the 80s that we discovered that they in fact had 20 warheads positioned in Cuba at that time, in addition to the missiles. So the threat that we faced in 1962 was even graver than what we had anticipated at that time. In 1962, at the end of May, they made the decision to start to ship missiles to Cuba. They did this covertly.
Reconnaissance photographs show offensive ballistic missile sites being constructed in Cuba, 90 miles from the U.S.
The Air Force made the flight on the 14th of October. They ran the whole length of Cuba and took pictures of actual medium-range ballistic missile sites being assembled with the missiles on the ground. The United States had positioned the spring of 1961 in Turkey and in Italy nuclear-tipped Jupiter missiles, which were perceived by Khrushchev as an immediate threat to the homeland. And this was the way that Khrushchev could position missiles close to the United States as we had done in Turkey.
Photo analysis confirms Soviet missile sites and bombers, both capable of carrying nuclear bombs to the U.S.
On the 15th of October, they validated that afternoon that they were in fact offensive missiles being positioned in Cuba.
Kennedy, informed of missile sites and bombers, forms the Executive Committee of National Security, EXCOM.
The president was briefed at 10 o'clock the next morning on the 16th. All this was done in secret, and President Kennedy immediately assembled a group of advisors. The Air Force and General LeMay were adamant that we should do an airstrike. Some of the others in the room, specifically those at State Department, our ambassador to the United Nations, and others felt that we should not do an airstrike.
U-2 reconnaissance flights show Soviet missiles on the ground in Cuba. Kennedy puts the military on full alert.
On the 17th, they were on the side of an invasion. One option would be publicly to go and make an announcement and use diplomacy to try to resolve the issue. The second one was to create a blockade.
Kennedy meets Soviet Foreign Minister Gromyko and warns of grave consequences of offensive weapons in Cuba.
They continued to receive intelligence from U-2 overflights that the missile sites were being rapidly assembled.
We went up in the Iceland-UK gap. The United States put up an anti-submarine barrier, which would have consisted of P-3 aircraft as the first line, and then destroyers as a second line, and then submarines behind that. And we heard the whole Russian fleet going by. And I actually had made arrangements with my wife because we knew New London. If we ever went to nuclear war, I mean, New London, Connecticut, home and submarine force was a big hole in the ground. And she was going to, her parents had a place up in New Hampshire on a lake up there, a summer home, and she was going to go there and wait for me. I truly believe that we were on the brink of World War III.
XCOM discusses options for Kennedy, an airstrike and invasion of Cuba, or a blockade of the island.
On the 19th of October, the president asked them to prepare two speeches for him. One speech would be to announce that we were invading Cuba. The second speech would be to announce that we were creating a quarantine or a blockade at that time. I was an ensign in 1962. I was attached to the USS Fisk, and we pulled back into Mayport, Florida on the 19th of October. At 1 o'clock in the morning, we got a phone call to return to the ship immediately. We departed at 3 o'clock in the morning, and we were sent out to join the Enterprise. And we stayed with the Enterprise for 75 days. The Enterprise was steaming at 35 knots continuously, which is their cruising speed. There were torpedo boats out, and Castro was on the radio saying he was going to sink the pride of the U.S. fleet that night.
I received a phone call from the ship saying, "Get back right away, we're going on a quarantine of Cuba." As the operations officer, I briefed the crew on, as we were heading out to station, on what could happen. And I said, if we board a Russian ship and if we are met with resistance, we shoot to kill.
Kennedy is inclined to place a blockade on all ships carrying military equipment to Cuba, calling it a quarantine.
On Saturday, intelligence continued to pour in that the missile sites were being readied. They also were confirming the fact that there were significant Soviet troops.
It's a Saturday afternoon and the phone rings. And when I say the phone, I mean the landline at my parents' house. And I'm told to report to my ship in Norfolk immediately. The fear factor among us was just tremendously elevated for not knowing exactly what was going on, what our mission was, what the crisis was.
President Kennedy meets with the Air Force Chiefs of Staff and makes a decision to put the quarantine in place.
On Sunday night, the president called the Chief of Staff of the Air Force for one last meeting, and General LeMay, because the Air Force wanted to do an invasion, an airstrike. When the Air Force came in at that time and said that he should expect 20 to 30,000 casualties as a result of the invasion. Unbeknownst to the United States until later, the troops in Cuba had tactical nuclear weapons on site. Had we conducted an airstrike, it would have been Armageddon.
President Kennedy's speech to the nation reveals offensive weapons in Cuba and places a quarantine of Cuba.
On Monday night, the 22nd, the president made his announcement.
Shall be the policy of this nation to regard any nuclear missile launched from Cuba against any nation in the Western Hemisphere as an attack by the Soviet Union on the United States.
I was sitting holding a transistor radio next to Mount 51 with the first man on the ship, listening to him with all the powers invested in me as President of the United States. I hereby declare a quarantine on Cuba, and here I am. I heard the whole speech on my transistor radio, standing by Route 51, Mount 51, looking at Cuba, 3 miles off.
American ships moved toward their positions along the blockade line. Soviet ships bound for Cuba stopped dead in the water.
Khrushchev's initial response on Tuesday morning to the president's speech was balanced and asked for the president to reconsider this rash action and to cancel it. On Tuesday night, the president put the Strategic Air Command on public DEFCON 2, is called cock pistol in those days, and that was as close to war as you could get to war. He ordered the Navy to activate the blockade effective 10 o'clock on Wednesday morning.
A huge 707 comes in directly perpendicular to the coast and has to make a sharp 90-degree turn to land. And he lands from west to east. And as he made the turn, he cartwheeled in and blew up. And it blew up. And it blew up. It was carrying ammunition. And the captain came on and said, something very pithy. He said, "That, gentlemen, is the price of freedom."
The U.S. allows ships not carrying military equipment to proceed to Cuba. U-2s show missile sites near completion.
The Navy put 300 ships to sea. There were probably 800 bomber assets, either up, on the ground, or dispersed in the United States. The president has sent a letter to Khrushchev on Wednesday asking that all of the offensive weapons be removed. I wanted to add that that letter was transmitted across the streets of Washington by bicycle to a Western Union office. And also, subsequently, we have learned that the Soviet ambassador's telegrams to the Kremlin were transmitted from the same Western Union office. When I read that for the first time and understood that for the first time, is what would have happened to the world had that bicycle been hit by a car?
No email, no internet, no cell phones, no 24/7 news channels. So how you got your information and from what sources was relatively primitive compared to what we have now.
Khrushchev responds he will not obey the blockade nor remove the missiles. The missile sites are confirmed operational.
Khrushchev's response on Thursday was belligerent. He said that we will not obey by the blockade. There were 19 cargo ships headed to Cuba, and those ships continued without change in course. President Kennedy again transmitted a letter on Thursday after the belligerent response of Khrushchev, and he re-emphasized and was not aggressive, but was very, very forceful that the conditions we have laid down must be met. Each day, the U-2 flights were confirming that the sites were being completed, and by Thursday, they were operational.
Concern over Khrushchev belligerence leads EXCOM to consider invading Cuba to take control of missile sites.
We had no idea at that point, after Thursday's exchange, what the Soviet Union would do. What happened on Friday is the ships that were transient to Cuba paused, and there was hope that there would be a resolution of the crisis. On Friday night, Khrushchev agreed to remove the weapons, the offensive weapons, from Cuba, and he would allow that to be inspected by the United Nations if the United States would pledge not to invade Cuba.
Gentlemen, there will be no more practice alerts. The next time the klaxon blows, you're going to be launching. That was very sobering. And we're watching on television as the events are happening, and the freighters are getting closer and closer, and we're sitting there eating lunch. This was in 1962, I believe was the year. And all of a sudden the klaxon blew. Once we got in the airplane and got strapped in, that 30 seconds or so until the message came through were the longest 30 seconds of my life. And I was just waiting for a red dot message. And it came through as a green dot. Somebody had goofed by blowing the klaxon.
A U-2 is downed over Cuba by a Soviet missile. Khrushchev agrees to withdrawal if the U.S. removes missiles from Turkey.
On Saturday, the president received another letter from Khrushchev. I'll agree to move out if you agree to take the missiles out of Turkey, and we will agree to an inspection.
President Kennedy and Premier Khrushchev accept both public and secret agreements to end the Cuban Missile Crisis.
The president had decided on Sunday morning that he was going to answer to the first letter, and he was going to disregard the second letter, as if he had never received it. He also instructed Attorney General Kennedy to talk to the Soviet ambassador in private that the United States would probably favor removal of the missiles in Turkey and probably also in Italy, but not for several months after the resolution of this crisis. But you have my word that we will do this. Khrushchev agreed to all the terms that the president had outlined. If the United States would pledge not to invade Cuba, to remove the missiles, to remove the troops, also had asked to remove the torpedo boats that they had put in and to allow the United Nations to conduct an inspection.
Well, we did go on board the Russian ships to make sure that the missiles were on there. And that was one thing. The Russians were courteous. They had all their sailors on deck, and they fell in formations to attention when we came on board. Of course, we're Marines with loaded rifles. They welcomed us aboard and did not stand in our way or question us or anything. We just made sure that the missiles were there, and once we did that, we departed the ship.
That resolved the crisis, at least the immediate crisis. The crisis was not probably totally resolved until early January of the following year. So it was a scary moment because, you know, you can go to war, many wars we have gone to war because of misunderstandings. And there were so many opportunities for some crazy misunderstanding.
The things that amazed me were some of the mistakes that were made at the time that almost precipitated a war. A test launch of a missile out of Canaveral that was supposed to have been canceled and went off. And of course that shows up on everybody's radar as a missile launch. And how close that caused us to have a nuclear war at that time.
We have never, ever been that close to a nuclear war. And I believe, and I hope we never are again. And one of the things that we reckon back to is that bicycle and that telegraph.
It made me feel good that it happened. The Cuban Missile Crisis happened because it showed that even the Russians knew enough not to push the button too far to get into nuclear warfare, because everybody would be a loser. Literally everybody on the earth would be a loser.